So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining me today. I wanted to start by first thanking AAHHE for providing me with the opportunity to showcase my research. It's a privilege and an honor to be here with you today. My name is Edwin Perez, and I will be presenting my dissertation research titled The Life Cycle of STEM Intervention Programs from Adoption to Institutionalization. Brief overview of the presentation, pretty standard academic presentation. I'll start by talking and sharing a little bit about myself and then going to some of those key areas like the purpose and research questions, the frameworks that guide me, the methods, findings, and then at the end offer some time for Q&A. I'm going to aim to talk for about like 45 minutes, so give like 20 minutes of Q&A towards the end. And to start, I wanted to share a little bit about myself through 4 images. The first one I selected is me in 3rd grade, and I chose this because it gives me a chance to show that I had long hair once, but also to talk a little bit about my background. I come from a first-generation low-income background. I am the son of immigrants from Oaxaca, Mexico. I was born in Los Angeles, and I chose this picture because this was an interesting time in my life. So just a couple years before this, my parents actually decided to take me and my sister back to their hometown. And we actually lived there for an entire year. So I did pre-K and kindergarten in the US, and I was already starting to learn English. But being in Oaxaca for a year, I forgot how to speak English. And when we came back, I had to relearn the language. So I was just joking that that English is actually my 2nd and 3rd language. And when I get a little nervous, you can hear like the accent a little bit. But it was a very interesting time in my life because I was readjusting to what it meant to be in the US, to be an English speaker. And I think this is when my consciousness started to raise a little bit and start to see like differences across, starting to notice that like I didn't have things that other kids had, that my family didn't have things that other families had, like having a car or having like even cable, stuff like that. So I chose this image because that's what it reminds me of, like this time in my life where I was like readjusting, but also learning about society and the world around me. I continued my education in the US, my K through 12 in the LAUSD district. And I wouldn't say I was a particularly strong student, but my parents always valued education and they pushed education. So I knew I would pursue education further, but I didn't really know what that would look like. Back then, I didn't know what the FAFSA was, what a major was, anything. But I persevered and particularly got help from programs like AVID, but also a neighborhood youth association program that was near where I lived. So fast forward, I ended up getting into UC Merced and going to UC Merced. So this is my UC Merced graduation. You'll see my parents, my siblings, and my then girlfriend, now wife, at my UC Merced graduation. UC Merced was really important for me because I got involved in student affairs work. So I worked for the Office of Admissions, and I also worked for the Bright Success Center. So for the Office of Admissions, I was working multiple roles. I was a Bobcat caller, which is basically calling students to convince them to come to UC Merced. I was a tour guide for a little bit, and I was an admissions representative. So going to different schools in the Central Valley to help students to apply to the UC system and explain to them what a college education means. And the Bright Success Center, I was a success mentor. So I had like 6 to 8 mentees that were first-year students and guiding them through the process and talking to them about different strategies, pointing them to resources. And it was through these jobs that one of my supervisors told me, hey, you know, you can actually make a career out of this. So I decided to apply to a master's degree in student affairs, which led me to UCLA. And I got into the UCLA program. I did the master's in student affairs. But while I was there, I also met Dr. Sylvia Hurtado, who you can see here in this picture, and her then TA, now Dr. Kirstokobian, who really encouraged me to pursue a PhD. So I ended up doing the PhD in higher education and organizational change at UCLA. And during this time, I worked on a 3-year project with Dr. Hurtado. So as like the end of my first year, beginning of my second year, we actually applied with a proposal and we got funded. And that's the research that I did for 3 years. And I ended up using this data for my dissertation. So that's what I'm going to be sharing with you today. And now I am in, I moved to the University of Texas at El Paso. You can actually see in the background here, this is UTEP, the campus, and in the very far distance, you can see Juarez. So I'm here at the Natalicio Institute working with an incredible group of staff and staff members working on research at the intersection of computer science, HSIs, and organizational change research. So going into the actual research dissertation, starting with some background. So this is hard because historically, private foundations and federal agencies have heavily invested in helping institutions to innovate. Right now, we're seeing dismantling of funding to science education and other research entities. But before this year, there was a lot of funding going to different organizations in order to improve and develop programs that improve student success outcomes. And one of the main ways that they have done this is through STEM intervention programs. So STEM intervention programs are institutionally focused solutions to address the unequal outcomes among underrepresented groups in STEM fields. And STEM including science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, but also medicine. So STEM intervention programs don't necessarily look one way. They vary in their design, but they're unified under this common goal of addressing the factors that are associated with unequal STEM outcomes. So they can address areas like academic preparation, retention, career outcomes. And some examples of that would be like an academic support service like tutoring or study groups, having an undergraduate research and mentoring experience, but they can also be what are called comprehensive programs. So comprehensive programs offer multiple services and supports under one umbrella. And SIPs have actually been shown to be pretty effective. So they increase students' GPA, they increase graduation, placement, and internships and careers. So they are a promising way to address unequal outcomes. However, most of the research documents the outcomes and the models that SIPs use, but there is very little knowledge and research on how to actually implement, adapt, sustain, and institutionalize these SIPs across our organizations. So this is where this dissertation and this research comes in, as we can learn valuable lessons about how STEM interventions go through a life cycle by examining the Meyerhoff Adaptation Partnership. So the Meyerhoff Adaptation Partnership was started back in 2013, abbreviated as MAP. And this was really an effort to replicate the UMBC Meyerhoff Scholars Program into two distinct organizational settings. So at Penn State, they created the Millennium Scholars Program. And at UNC-Chapel Hill, they created the Chancellor Science Scholars Program. And this was done in collaboration with the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, who provided funding, but also resources like having a space to have meetings and debriefings, things like that. So this is really at the heart of this study, examining the Meyerhoff Adaptation Partnership, how these organizations took an existing model and replicated to create two new programs. A little bit of context of Meyerhoff Scholars Program, if you're not familiar, it's one of the most well-documented and successful programs. It's been active for over 30 years. It was first established in 1988. Back then, it was originally designed just to provide Black male undergraduate students support and who were committed to obtaining a PhD in math, science, and engineering. After, it was open to Black women, and after that, it was open to everyone. But they do prioritize students from diverse backgrounds. And to showcase some of the success of Meyerhoff, they have had more than 1,400 students go through the program. Their alumni have earned 369 PhDs, 66 of those being MD PhDs, 180 MD degrees, over 300 master's degree, and 340 alumni are actively enrolled in graduate school. And this is 2021 numbers, so I'm sure it's a lot higher now, 4 years later. So the way that the Meyerhoff Scholars has had this success, primarily people speak about these 13 key elements, and this is done through a cohort model. So students are recruited in a group. It varies year by year. Sometimes it could be 30, 40, even 60 students recruited all at once, and they are supported by these 13 key elements. So if you remember the term comprehensive STEM program. So this is a very comprehensive STEM program in that they have these 13 interrelated components. So they offer things like financial aid, a summer bridge program. Students live together in the same housing. They receive tutoring, advising, mentors. So it's a very involved program Something that folks don't really talk about when they talk about Meyerhoff is these more implicit values. So they have a lot of values, and the ones I want to stress is that this is a program that is focused on both excellence and diversity. And I bring this up because later we'll talk about some of the problems that this caused. Because oftentimes when a program is for students from racially diverse backgrounds, it's seen as something that is deficient. You're having to try to address deficiencies in students. So excellence and diversity are often seen as mutually exclusive, as things rather than things that go hand in hand. But they also promote things like group success, which a lot of students of color value collectivism over individualism, community, collaboration, discipline, and they're guided by four pillars of success. So having the highest expectation of students, the importance of building community, the importance of faculty and student engagement. So one of the sayings was that it takes scientists to create scientists. So really getting students involved with faculty to develop their research skills, which will ultimately lead them to PhD careers. And then improvement through program assessment. So the program has a very strong evaluation component. So they evaluate their outcomes and publish them in scholarly outlets. So this led to the creation of the Chancellor Science Scholars Program at UNC-Chapel Hill. UNC-Chapel Hill is a very selective Research One university and predominantly white. So if we look at the class of 2022, 65% of their students identified as white, while only 21% of their students identified as Black, Latinx, or Indigenous. However, if we look at around the same time, the ninth cohort of CSS, 80% of their scholars were of color and 80% were women scholars. Similarly, Penn State, they work in a university system, so they have multiple campuses across the state. University Park is the flagship campus, and this is where the program is housed. There are also Research One, predominantly white university. Similar stats in 2022, 65% of the student body was white, and only 13% of students identify as Black, Latinx, or Indigenous. And for Millennium Scholars, 81% of their scholars were of color and 59% were women scholars. So we can see some pretty stark differences across the student body and who these programs serve. So really the purpose of this study was to study this life cycle of the Chancellor Science Scholars Program and the Millennium Scholars Program in order to develop key lessons that inform campuses on how to navigate their SIPs through distinct stages. And now that I'm reflecting on the dissertation, it's not necessarily just related to STEM intervention programs. This could be applied to different programs. So if it's an initiative, like a program geared towards a specific group like Latinx students or a different program, we can learn lessons about how to take your program from its inception all the way to trying to institutionalize it. And also understand how a racialized organization affects the life cycle of these SIPs, particularly SIPs that are culturally responsive. So going back to that idea of this commitment to diversity and excellence. I was guided by three main research questions. So I divided them up by the distinct stages. So the first one being about the process of implementing the Meyerhoff Scholars Program at UNC-Chapel Hill and at Penn State. And I had some sub-questions. So for example, like what elements, so if we go back to those 13 components, what elements were more widely adopted and what was more challenging to the existing practices and norms of these predominantly white research universities? And how did these institutional environments respond to the introduction of these programs? Second question was about adaptations. So what adaptations did the CSS and MLM programs make to the Meyerhoff model in order to fit into their unique institutional context, and to what extent did this affect model fidelity? The third one, what key mechanisms did the CSS and MLM programs employ to achieve sustainability and institutionalization at UNC-Chapel Hill and Penn State? So I was guided by multiple frameworks. I'm not going to go through all of them. I think the thing that I want to stress is that really what this dissertation provides, it's an organizational focus. So I was leveraging a lot of organizational frameworks and theories, and that's one critique that I have, that a lot of our STEM education research focuses mainly on students and how do we change students rather than how do we change organizations, organizational environments so that they're more conducive to student success. So throughout the different stages, I leveraged different organizational theories and frameworks to try to understand these stages. And one of those reasons I did that is because very few research actually exists that does this. So a lot of these theories I borrowed from like clinical and behavioral interventions. How do you implement those? Because that's what existed, and I brought that into the higher education field. I think the one I do want to stress is this theory here, theory of racialized organizations, and I put it in dotted lines to show that it permeates the entire life cycle, not just one stage. So what does it mean for a university to be a racialized organization? Put the most simply is that rather than being race neutral, organizations actually operate as racial structures, meaning that they have the power to reproduce or produce racial inequalities through enhancing or diminishing the agency of racial groups. So this comes from Victor Ray, his piece in 2019. And one of the three main ways that this happens is through the legitimization of unequal distribution of resources among racial lines. So resources going inequitably to people of color over dominant groups like white people. And whiteness also serves as a credential. This one's a little sticky, but it mainly relates to norms and processes. So for example, if you think about when you're looking for a job, somebody who comes from my background, who comes from a first generation, low income, Latinx background, I don't necessarily have the networks in place to be able to, let's say, for example, look for a professor or look for somebody, whereas somebody who comes from a more dominant background, maybe their family has a connection and they can work for this company or this other company. And also there's certain cultural norms. So there's certain ways of acting, of behaving, of being that are expected of you that you don't necessarily have because you don't come from that same background. And then lastly, commitments to diversity, equity, and inclusion are decoupled. So that means that the actual policies that are in place are not what are actually done in practice. So to summarize, our organizations can actually produce or reproduce racial inequality through their actions. So the research methods that I used was multiple case study design. If you're familiar with multiple case study design, you kind of move away from starting to explore the case context and more to this collective phenomenon. So the collective phenomenon that I'm studying is the life cycle of STEM intervention programs. And really what informs that is the case context. So I'm looking at the CSS program, at the MLM program, and what do they tell me about the life cycle of STEM intervention programs? Typically, in multiple case study design, you use multiple sources of evidence. It can be things like documents, archival records, interviews, physical artifacts. You don't have to use all of them, but it's important to use multiple because they serve a triangulation function. So you're able to corroborate your findings. So for example, in interviews, if somebody tells you something, you should be able to go and look at a document perhaps where it's like Board of Trustees minutes or a newspaper article that showcases the things that people are telling you. And there's also 4 pillars of data collection. So what I was talking about, triangulation, building a case database, maintaining a chain of evidence, and then being careful with data from social media. In terms of data that we collected, as I mentioned earlier, this was from a larger project that I worked with Dr. Hurtado and other members, so a postdoctoral scholar and fellow graduate students back when I was doing the PhD. So this larger study, I used all the data from it, and we collected 91 interviews with 72 participants at UMBC, UNC-Chapel Hill, and Penn State. They were conducted online and in person. This was like very close to COVID time, so we adapted. We did online interviews, but we were also able to go to campus, to these campuses. So we interviewed institutional leaders. So this could be like presidents, provosts, deans, program staff, the people who actually worked in the program, faculty members who did research with students or were in the STEM fields, and evaluators of these programs. We also web scraped documents, so publicly available resources like strategic plans, enrollment data, things like that. And like I mentioned, we did site visits to all 3 campuses to observe the programs in the real life context. For data analysis, we use these documents and web scrape data to create institutional narrative reports. So that was important to understand the case context, understand what's going on, not just within the university, but also at like higher levels. So what's happening in the state legislature, what's happening in society, what are the current events that are really playing a role in this. For example, at UNC around this time, if some of you remember, there was a big controversy with Nicole Hannah-Jones, and a lot of faculty members were talking about that controversy with her tenure case. So that was something that really helped us to understand the specific case context. Because if we might have did a site visit a few months before, maybe this would not have been the case. Um, Coding, this is one of my best ideas and one of my worst ideas because I did a focused recoding of all 91 interviews. It took me a really long time, but I felt like it was very important to do because the larger study was really focused on understanding the impact that these programs make. It wasn't necessarily focused on the different stages. We did have research questions that related to that, but it wasn't the main focus. So I did this focus recoding with the theories that I brought in to understand these distinct stages and how programs go from being implemented all the way to being institutionalized. And I use cross-case analysis, so within case analysis, really to understand those individual cases alone, and then afterwards comparative case analysis to understand commonalities and differences. Some limitations, it's a limited number of cases, but qualitative data doesn't really seek to be comprehensive. It's about understanding the specific context. Also, typical SIPs are not comprehensive SIPs like MSP, CSS, and MLM. Usually this is because of resources. It's super expensive to implement programs that have 13 different components. So this might not apply to singular interventions, but I think there's still some crossover. And then lastly, the institutional context that these programs were implemented in were PWIs and research ones. So the life cycle and its challenges, its opportunities may look differently in different contexts like MSI. So institutions like HSIs or HBCUs, findings might be different. Okay. So moving to research findings, finally getting to the fun stuff. Caveat to this, my research findings chapter was over 130 pages long. So I drastically had to reduce my research findings down to like about 20 slides. So there's a lot of nuances and a lot of different things that I'm not going to be able to talk about today. I wanted to make it a little bit more accessible and go back to really why I wanted to do this dissertation and is to provide those key lessons. So the way that I organized the research findings is I'm going to show you the model that I developed, and then every stage I'm going to show you a quote so you can hear the participant's voice, and then give you those key strategies for that specific stage. So this is the model that I developed after analyzing all the data. It's a conceptual model for what the life cycle of STEM intervention programs might look like. So we begin with institutional readiness and the pre-implementation phase. Afterwards, we go to early implementation, and there's a contextual response. Afterwards, there's continuous implementation and adjustments. Caveat that adjustments can permeate the entire life cycle. So it's not limited to just one stage. You can continue to make adjustments, and usually you are making adjustments throughout every single stage. You employ sustainability strategies to try to maintain your program, and you work towards institutionalization. And throughout this entire process, programs are always going to be navigating institutional power dynamics and resource-based challenges. So for the first stage, institutional readiness and pre-implementation, this is a quote from a UMBC participant that I think summarizes this stage well. And they say, "We kept using the phrase strike while the iron is hot. And the iron was hot, but I wondered, did it leave a scar? These programs are difficult, so you have to sit and do it. There is a process and rigor and challenge to a lot of things. And until you are just in it, you don't appreciate it." And I think that is the case with many of these kind of initiatives. There are always politics involved, and why people get involved and why people are there and why they support becomes really important. At some point, you think, are people making a name for themselves, or are they really trying to do a greater good? And that's the truth. And are those things mutually exclusive? Maybe not, but at times you wonder. So institutional readiness for change is key. When you introduce a new program, it can be seen as a threat to the routine functioning of organizations and the organizational hierarchy, particularly if that program seeks to advance individuals of color in a place that has been historically white and has historically favored white norms and values. So to help mitigate these challenges, it's important to assess an institution's readiness for change before implementing a program. So implementation teams must engage in a reflective process in which they assess their institutional context, their culture, to understand the barriers that they might encounter, but also the resources that they could leverage. Some key actions that I found that facilitate implementation are things like garnering buy-in and commitment from the broader campus community. So really trying to understand who are going to be your allies, who are going to be your supporters, who can you go to when you need solutions to problems. Developing clear goals for the program and metrics of success. So in the first year, what is your goal? Is it to recruit this number of students, to develop this part of your program? You have to select your program leadership and staff, and you have to figure out key logistical details like how will this program be funded, where will the program be placed, and what does the reporting structure look like? So are you going to have a program director, program coordinators, those type of logistical details. Moving on to the implementation phase, this is probably one of my favorite quotes. If you remember, research question 1 was about like what things were easy, what were challenging. So that was one of the questions that we asked, was about like, what is something that was easy to implement about the program? And one participant said, nothing was easy. There was complications in every way. Nothing was easy. And I think that perfectly summarizes the implementation phase. There was various challenges. I'm only going to focus on 3. The first one being related to program placement. So program placement really matters. And what I mean by program placement is often when we develop programs, we house them in a specific academic unit or department or college. So what I find is that central placement really matters because it places you in proximity to power and resources. So if we look at the placement of the CSS program, they were placed under a department called Honors Carolina. And Honors Carolina is situated under the College of Arts and Sciences. And then College of Arts and Sciences is situated under the Office of the Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost. So really there's this kind of distance between the program and the Executive Vice Provost. So you have to go through multiple levels of bureaucracy. And that created challenges for the Chancellor Science Scholars Program, whereas the Millennium Scholars Program is housed directly under the Office of the Executive Vice Provost and President. And at the same time, Penn State has a different model. So the STEM colleges, each college, instead of being, for example, the Department of Earth Mineral Sciences, the Department of Engineering, they're all independent colleges. So that created some interesting things where you're working in collaboration with multiple colleges that are doing their own thing, have their own initiatives, have their own deans. So program placement really matters, thinking about like where are you going to house this program and how does that relate to the things that you're going to be able to do. The next one is about funding models. So funding models really shape your access to resources. So going back to Penn State, initially each college was responsible for raising funds for their students. So as I mentioned, one of the components is financial aid. So colleges needed to provide aid to pay for like tuition, but this was a challenge because some colleges were more it was easier for them to get resources. So for example, like College of Engineering, it was a lot easier to get resources than, let's say, the College of Earth Mineral Sciences. So this created these disparities where some colleges were able to fund a lot of students and fully fund them, whereas some other colleges were not able to fund students completely. And actually, one thing that happened was that college administrators took funds from the existing STEM diversity programs within these colleges and gave it to the Millennium Scholars Program to fund that. So that created a lot of problems because what should have been their allies, other diversity programs, really created some tension because they took away money from these existing diversity initiatives and gave it to this new program, which, as I mentioned earlier, can oftentimes see as a threat to the organizational functioning because it's taking away resources from efforts that are currently going. Afterwards, one of the ways that they solved this was to move it to the office of the provost, and each college contributed $10,000, and then the provost office would provide matching funds to fund these students. For CSS, they started from strong commitments with the chancellor, hence the name Chancellor Science Scholars, which allowed them to overcome these zero-sum outcomes. So a story that the chancellor told us was that they had discretionary resources and they used all their discretionary resources to give to the Chancellor Science Scholars so that they can avoid any of these resource-based challenges. And they also took advantage of existing programs like the Carolina Covenant, which was used to fund lower income students. And then the last one, research question 1, sub-question B was about how these programs are introduced into an existing ecosystem. So one of the main challenges that occurred for MLN was that there was concern over duplicating existing efforts and pulling away resources. So this mainly happened through the Honors College. There was a lot of problems that went on with this. The Honors College in the beginning didn't want Millennium Scholars to like have the words honors or scholars because they felt some type of ownership over that term. They didn't want to give them access to the honors only dorms. So there was a lot of problems that were described as a territorial nature in these institutions. And another problem was this siloed nature. So as I mentioned, like each STEM college was separate. So they have their own dean, they had an associate dean of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So they had existing initiatives, but they were all siloed. One of the main ways that Millennium overcame this was by demonstrating how they're unique. So really stressing the fact that they're focused on getting diverse students to STEM PhDs, which was something that no other program or initiative at Penn State was doing. CSS, they didn't really encounter the same challenges, but it was mainly because there was no other programs that were doing that had the same goals. Again, STEM PhDs who come from underrepresented minority communities. Moving on to the continuous implementation and adaptation phase. So this is a quote from a Penn State participant. They say, when people read the program elements on paper, from the outside perspective, people are like, yep, check, we can do this. Study groups, absolutely. Tutoring, check. All the elements seem very standard, common practice. But when one really thinks about Meyerhoff and one really thinks about what needed to happen to really incorporate these elements, I would say that's where the growing pains were. What I mean by that is that Meyerhoff is rooted in Black culture. It's unapologetically embracing of the strength of Black churches, community uplift, and support. And that didn't come through to adopters. So I would say here at Penn State, we were not prepared at all to create an adaptation that really looked like Meyerhoff. And if we go back to the Meyerhoff Scholars Program model, as I mentioned, there's components that are more functional. So things like financial aid, summer bridge, study groups, those are things that are easier to understand and easier to implement because there's an understanding of what they are and how to do them. Whereas things like program values, program community, family involvement, and these different values like commitment to diversity, collaboration, those are a little bit more abstract. And it's also based on what your own perceptions of what those values are and look like. So that was one of the things that was most challenging. It was really implementers struggled with understanding why certain values were important to promote student success for underrepresented groups in STEM. So this notion of collective success, there was challenges in understanding why do we need to put collective success forward over competition or individualism? Why do we have to affirm and celebrate student identities? And like I was mentioning before, really demonstrating that diversity and excellence are not mutually exclusive, that they can go hand in hand. And lastly, these programs have a very explicit focus on racial equity over other forms of diversity and underrepresentation. So this was a problem as the implementers didn't want to promote racial equity for various reasons, and some reasons including legal challenges. So they didn't want to face legal challenges. As you might remember, UNC-Chapel Hill has faced legal challenges around affirmative action. So they were more cautious about implementing specific initiatives around racial equity. And then adapting an existing model is possible, but replicating is not. So there's a lot of variability among institutional contexts and culture across campuses. This does not allow for a strict replication. Rather, programs need to be adapted to their unique new context. There was various ways that the programs were adapted. For example, one of them was academic requirements. One of them was GPA minimums. So the MLM program across the board, most of them are a 3.0 GPA. You have to maintain a 3.0 GPA. But MLN, the early implementers wanted to show, going back to this idea of diversity and excellence are not mutually exclusive, they wanted to show that they were not giving a break to students of color. So they raised the GPA minimums to 3.5 to try to show that they were just as talented as other students. This was creating more inequality than it was actual equity. So they reduced the GPA back down to 3.0, which is standard across other programs, not just Meyerhoff programs, but other programs across the campus. Other adaptations was creating more intentional DEI programming. as a response to hostile climates. So if you remember a few years ago, there was white supremacist marches on the UNC-Chapel Hill campus, which is something that is like incredibly drastic and something that needs to be addressed. But there wasn't as much intentional programming within these programs. So really the program staff wanted to create more programming around DEI. How do we talk about these issues? How do we go about navigating these issues? And that was one adaptation that they created. There was other adaptations that were rooted in some of the history of Meyerhoff. So Meyerhoff, as you may recall, was started back in 1988. So there were some more, I guess you can call them like old school ways of doing things. So for example, men would hold the door open for women. Everybody would like stand in one line. Everybody sits at the front of the class. So really, the program started to adapt those and remove those. And Meyerhoff has as well. But they talk about this is part of their history. This is part of this almost politics of responsibility. Because back in like 1998, in order to be taken seriously, in order for these Black men to be taken seriously, they had to play this respectability politics where you have to dress up, you have to show that that you are worthy of being respected. So that comes from with a certain history that a lot of people didn't understand, but have now been adapted to adopt to the modern day. And there has been some deviations in their mission. So a big focal point of Meyerhoff is to pursue STEM PhDs, whereas these programs, they're still encouraging STEM PhDs, but they're more willing to allow students to do medical degrees or other type of degrees in those fields. And they have expanded what diversity means. So moving away from diversity as just racial diversity, but also thinking about what it means to be diverse in STEM. So gender diversity, sexuality diversity, disability, things like that. And then retaining these high levels of fidelity to the original model required fidelity mechanisms. So really what this meant was that you have to have systems and structures in place in order to be able to replicate these programs to a certain degree that is similar to the original program. So this partnership with HHMI really sustained that partnership because it allowed for the transfer of knowledge. So you had documents, meetings, site visits across the institutions, and HHMI made funding contingent on adopting all aspects of the model. So a lot of people want to take a piece from Meyerhoff and implement that, but really this was an experiment to see if you can adopt an entire model. And program leaders also serve as fidelity mechanisms. So really having program leaders and staff who get the Meyerhoff way, the value of like collective achievement, of diversity, really helps you to maintain true to the values of the Meyerhoff model. Okay, almost there. The sustainability and institutionalization phase is the quote from a UNC-Chapel Hill participant. They say, "I can't stress enough that it needs to be everybody. I think sometimes there is a sense incorrect that this is for minority students, so we'll recruit more minority faculty and then they'll run it." While you absolutely want more minority faculty because it's important that these students see what's possible, everybody has to think that this is important. You can't just put it on faculty of color and say, well, you guys need to make this work. It's important that the entire campus supports it. That is a critical piece, because if it's just a few people that are supposed to support it, I think it has a greater chance of not being as successful as Meyerhoff. So really, sustainability is contingent on multiple strategies. These are the 4 main strategies that I talk about in the dissertation. So obtaining buy-in and sustained support from key organizational members. This includes staff, faculty, senior administrators. You need to scale your programs through organizational and financial development. So these are things like program placement. So if you started your program in a department, it might mean that you need to move it somewhere else. You need to look at your funding model. How are you generating revenue for the program? You can increase sustainability by showcasing your value. So aligning it with the values and mission of the institution. For example, I think things are changing a little bit, but historically, a lot of campuses had diversity goals within their strategic plan. So how does your program relate to those equity goals? And how is it a centerpiece for advancing the equity goals that institutions have? And then lastly, you need to demonstrate your value by showing evidence-based success, and that's that evaluation component. So I'm only going to stress two of these. The first one about obtaining buy-in. Really, the reason why you need this is because individuals at different levels can leverage their power. So, for example, central administrators can really leverage the power of their role to find solutions to challenges, especially those that are related to resources. So they can provide money, space, things like that you might need. Faculty and staff are critical to running these program elements. So you can't have students do research if you don't have faculty members that are involved doing research with these students. One of the ways that the campuses have been able to generate this buy-in is by developing a steering committee or an advisory board that's composed of members from across the institution. So as you might remember, these are comprehensive programs. So for like Summer Bridge, you need to have space on campus. So you need to talk to like residential life, to the dining commons. There's multiple areas you need to talk to admissions. So bringing those key people in together to communicate, to check in, is really important to create this buy-in and sustain support for the programs. And then lastly, one of our participants stressed that you don't have to be a minority to help minority students. So because this takes place in a PWI context, is especially critical, that we can't leave the success of these programs just to minority communities. And like I mentioned, evaluation is necessary to demonstrate the value of the program. So if you evaluate these programs, you can show their strength to students, to departments, to universities, to other funding agencies. They can create buy-in, assist in fundraising goals, and serves as a legitimizing function. But programs and campuses must be ready and willing to adequately fund the assessment component to reap these benefits. And for the CSS and MLM programs in particular, they have had a lot of challenges with adequately funding the evaluation component. Okay, last one, institutionalization phase. This is not a quote from a participant, but it is from a theory that I used. So it says organizational change and its institutionalization are inexorably linked. Change is difference, institutionalization is making that difference last. So really what I want to stress with this is that institutionalization is a continuous process rather than being a stage that you can achieve. So a lot of people, when we asked about what it meant to be institutionalized, they talked about simply moving away from being grant funded to being funded by the institution. Rather, I argue that institutionalization of a equity-centered program is about embedding the values and norms of these programs into the fabric of the institution. So therefore, institutionalizing a program will require continuous work and commitment from the entire university. Equity work has no deadline. Systems of oppressions do not take a break, so we can't take a break either. Okay, implications and recommendations of this research. So some things that I think are applicable to a wider audience community focused around research is taking this life cycle approach. So particularly when it comes to understanding how to generate successful outcomes, we need to understand processes that lead to success through distinct stages. So we have a lot of knowledge on the outcomes and the elements that work, but not necessarily the processes. So this like how question, how do we actually take programs from these different stages? How do we engage our resources? How do we engage, how do we change mindsets, behaviors to be more conducive to success? So taking this life cycle approach can help us with that. Similarly, more research on SIPs and STEM education needs to see organizations as units of analysis. So a lot of STEM education research has focused on an individual level, on a student level, that really focuses on fixing students rather than fixing organizations. So focusing on organizational aspects like cultures and structures will lead us to new knowledge that transforms our organizations. And if we use more organizational theory, this will help us facilitate this. I have feelings about the word intervention. So one of the things that I talk about is moving away from this term of STEM intervention program to a perspective of a STEM inclusion program. And this leads to this idea of we need to create inclusive STEM environments. So going back to if we're only focused on individual level interventions, we're always going to need those interventions because we're not changing the underlying structures of what actually creates barriers and challenges for students. So we need to think about how we can create inclusive science environments, not about what other interventions we can continue to deploy, because you're going to have to keep doing these type of things. So these are systemic problems. We need systemic solutions, not individual solutions. And then another one that I want to stress, recommendations for practice, is that the success of these programs and equity in general are a shared responsibility. It takes an entire university. Sustained support needs to come from across the university and at multiple levels. And again, stressing that the burden of success cannot be left to people of color to bear. Transformation emerges when the most powerful people in the university take meaningful action to catalyze change. And as white individuals have traditionally and continue to hold positions of power in our organizations, it's necessary to leverage that power to help create a more inclusive and equitable environment. Okay, wrapping up. As you have seen from this work, efforts to create change through STEM intervention programs can be incredibly difficult, with multiple challenges emerging along the way. But we also saw that dedicated groups of people who are committed to the success of students can make a meaningful and lasting difference. So our efforts to work towards greater equity are never easy, but they are necessary if we are to cultivate and create the next generation of diverse scientists. Thank you. Feel free to connect with me if you have additional questions. My email's here and also a QR code for my LinkedIn if you want to keep in touch. So that's all I have. I have about, I think, like 15-ish minutes for Q&A if folks have questions about the research, or even if we have grad students here who have questions about the dissertation phase or things like that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Perez. And yes, we do have, looks like so far, one question from Nancy. She asked, how can intersectionality as inquiry and praxis or proxy inform this work, sorry. And she said, for example, how could reporting impact by race, gender, parent level of education, ethnicity transform how we assess evidence-based impact?
Yeah, I think intersectionality is an important aspect of this. Like I mentioned, I wasn't able to include everything just because there was so much to include. I think especially in that notion of like, what does underrepresentation mean? In the STEM context, there's so many ways to be underrepresented that I think often we focus on singular ideas of what it means to be underrepresented. So what it means to be a woman in STEM, but we don't think about what does it mean to be a Black or Latina woman in STEM. So I think intersectionality is a very important concept to engage with, and something that I look forward to engaging when I write this research and write up these publications.
Are there any other questions? And if you would like to be invited to unmute, if that's easier for you, just let me know. You can either raise your hand or just send a message in the chat. That's another way. Nancy put a resource in the chat, looks like.
Well, thank you for the resource.
Just want to give at least another few seconds in case anybody is typing an answer or a question in the chat. It looks like someone asked, what is next regarding this topic? How are you planning to continue the conversation?
What's next is I have to publish this work. I haven't gotten around to publishing it yet, but that's one big goal, to publish this work. I'm likely going to divide them up into the distinct stages. So a paper on what it takes to implement them, adapting, sustaining, things like that. But I mean, I think this work has really been life-changing for me because it really helped me to even like get this postdoc. So the postdoc that I'm currently working on is working on using like theories of organizational change, of STEM. So I'm still doing this work just in a different context. Now I'm very focused on Hispanic serving institutions. So applying the lessons that I learned from the dissertation now in the context of Hispanic serving institutions and computer science. That's the work that I'm doing right now. So publishing dissertation work, and also we're going to be working on publishing work out of my postdoc.
All right, anything else? I know there were a couple comments in the chat, which is great. Michelle said that she can't wait to read your publications.
Thank you, Michelle.
All right. Well, if that's it, I mean, while I'm, giving my closeout, feel free to drop any other questions or comments. But other than that, thank you everyone for your participation, and a big thank you to Dr. Perez for sharing your knowledge and insights with us. And congratulations again for receiving AAHHE's Outstanding Dissertation Award. I wish everyone a great afternoon and weekend, and we look forward to being with you on a future AAHHE program. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye.